What happens when Hollywood's most respected legend meets late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. Tonight's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live turned into an absolute disaster that has the entire entertainment industry talking. The confrontation that erupted between these two powerhouses was so intense, so unexpected, that it left the studio audience in complete shock, and Ford himself walking off the set in disgust. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. This is the kind of Hollywood drama that only happens once in a lifetime, and you're about to witness every explosive moment. The tension was palpable from the moment Harrison Ford stepped onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage. The legendary actor, known for his iconic roles as Han Solo and Indiana Jones, walked out with his usual measured confidence, but there was something different in his demeanor tonight. His jaw was set a little tighter than usual, his eyes scanning the audience with an almost wary expression. Ford had been making his rounds on the late-night circuit to promote his latest project, but whispers backstage suggested this appearance was different, mandatory rather than voluntary. Jimmy Kimmel bounded onto the stage with his typical exaggerated enthusiasm, flashing that trademark grin that has become synonymous with his brand of provocative comedy. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Harrison Ford." The audience erupted in applause, but Ford's response was notably subdued. He raised a hand in acknowledgement but didn't smile, didn't wave with his usual charm. Instead, he moved directly to his chair with the purposeful stride of a man who wanted to get this over with quickly. "Harrison, great to have you back on the show," Kimmel began, settling into his host chair with an almost predatory gleam in his eyes. "You know, it's been a while since we've had you here, and I have to say, you're looking—" Kimmel paused dramatically, letting his gaze travel over Ford with theatrical scrutiny. "Well, you're looking every bit your age." The comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Ford's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing, just a fraction. The audience wasn't sure whether to laugh or cringe at the backhanded compliment disguised as humor. Ford leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming once against the armrest, a telltale sign that those who knew him recognized as barely contained irritation. "Thanks, Jimmy," Ford replied, his voice carrying that distinctive gravelly tone, but with an edge that cut through the studio atmosphere. "You know, age is just a number. Experience, on the other hand, that's what separates the professionals from the—" He paused, letting his own dramatic silence fill the space. "Amateurs." Kimmel's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered, but the barb had clearly hit its mark. The host shifted in his chair, his energy becoming more aggressive, more focused. "Speaking of experience, I heard some interesting stories about your time on the new project. Word is, you weren't exactly the easiest person to work with on set." Ford's posture straightened, his legendary composure beginning to show cracks. "Where exactly did you hear that, Jimmy? Because I've been in this business for over 5 decades, and my reputation speaks for itself." "Oh, it does," Kimmel replied with a smirk that was becoming increasingly malicious. "Your reputation for being difficult, demanding, and frankly, past your prime is pretty well established in Hollywood circles." The studio fell silent. You could hear a pin drop as the audience realized they were witnessing something far beyond typical late-night banter. Ford's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles whitening as Kimmel's words sank in. This wasn't comedy anymore. This was character assassination disguised as entertainment. "I think you might want to be careful about where you're going with this," Ford said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more weight than if he had shouted. The veteran actor's eyes locked onto Kimmel's with the intensity of a man who had faced down countless adversaries, both on screen and off. But Kimmel, either oblivious to the warning or deliberately ignoring it, pressed forward with the reckless confidence of someone who believed his position as host made him untouchable. Careful? Harrison, this is comedy. This is what we do here. Maybe you're just not. He paused for effect, keeping up with how modern television works. The insult was deliberate, calculated, and devastating. Ford's jaw clenched as the implication hung in the air. That he was outdated, irrelevant, a relic of a bygone era who no longer understood his place in the entertainment landscape. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Ford's breathing had become more measured, deeper, the way a seasoned actor controls himself before delivering a career-defining performance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades in Hollywood, every word carefully chosen and delivered with surgical precision. "Modern television, Jimmy?" Ford's tone was deceptively calm, but anyone paying attention could hear the storm brewing beneath the surface. "You mean the kind where hosts think cheap shots and playground insults pass for wit? Where respect for guests is sacrificed for a few desperate laughs from an audience that deserves better?" Kimmel's face flushed, his carefully constructed host, persona beginning to crack under Ford's unflinching gaze. "Hey, look, Harrison, we're just having some fun here. You don't need to take everything so seriously. Maybe that's part of your problem. You can't roll with the punches anymore." "Roll with the punches?" Ford leaned forward, his legendary intensity now fully engaged. "Jimmy, I've rolled with punches from directors who were artists, comedians, who were actually funny, and critics who at least had the decency to base their opinions on facts rather than gossip and hearsay." The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't the playful back and forth they had come to expect from late-night television. This was raw, unfiltered tension between two men who clearly despised each other, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Kimmel, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far, but unable to back down without losing face, doubled down with the reckless abandon of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Facts? Harrison, the fact is that your last few movies have been box office disappointments. The fact is that younger actors are taking the roles you used to get. The fact is that Hollywood has moved on, and maybe it's time you did too." The words hit Ford like physical blows, each one carefully aimed at his professional legacy and personal pride. The camera captured the moment perfectly. The slight flinch, the tightening around his eyes, the way his hands slowly formed fists on the armrests of his chair. This was Harrison Ford, the man who had given life to some of cinema's most beloved characters, being torn down by a talk show host whose greatest achievement was making celebrities uncomfortable for entertainment value. "You want to talk about facts?" Ford's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it filled the entire studio. "Here's a fact for you, Jimmy. I've been making movies since before you were old enough to watch them. I've worked with legends, created characters that will outlive both of us, and earned the respect of everyone worth respecting in this industry." Ford stood slowly, his full height imposing even in the confines of the interview setup. "Here's another fact. I don't need to sit here and listen to some mediocre comedian who peaked with making people eat bugs try to tear down a lifetime of work for a few viral moments." The reference to Kimmel's earlier show was a direct hit, a reminder that for all his current success, his roots were in shock comedy and juvenile stunts. Kimmel's face went red, his composure completely shattered as Ford's words stripped away the veneer of respectability he had worked years to build. "Mediocre?" Kimmel's voice cracked slightly, his professional mask slipping entirely. "I've got an Emmy-nominated show. I've hosted the Oscars multiple times, and I have millions of viewers every night. What have you done lately besides coast on movies you made 30 years ago?" The attack was vicious, personal, and completely unprofessional. Ford's eyes blazed with an intensity that reminded everyone why he had been so convincing as an action hero. But instead of exploding, he became eerily calm, the kind of dangerous quiet that precedes a devastating counterattack. Ford took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence suddenly dominating the entire set. The studio lights seemed to dim around him as he commanded the space with the authority of a man who had spent decades owning every room he entered. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "What have I done lately?" Ford's laugh was cold, devoid of any humor. "Jimmy, while you've been hiding behind a desk making jokes about people braver than you'll ever be, I've been out there still taking risks, still pushing boundaries, still earning my place in this business every single day." The audience was transfixed, watching a masterclass in controlled fury. Ford's words weren't just a defense. They were a surgical dismantling of everything Kimmel represented. "You want to know what I've done lately? I've continued to work with directors who respect craft over clickbait. I've mentored young actors who understand that talent trumps cheap theatrics. And I've maintained my dignity while watching people like you turn entertainment into a blood sport." Kimmel tried to interrupt, but Ford's raised hand silenced him, with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "I'm not finished, Jimmy. You mentioned my box office numbers like they define my worth. Let me tell you something about worth. It's not measured in opening weekend receipts or social media mentions. It's measured in the respect of your peers, the integrity of your work, and the legacy you leave behind." Ford's voice gained power with each word, filling the studio with an energy that was both captivating and terrifying. "I've built a career that spans generations. Children who weren't born when I made my first movie still know my characters. Can you say the same about your late-night jokes? Will anyone remember your Emmy nominations when you're gone? Or will they just remember you as the host who traded dignity for ratings?" The words hung in the air like accusations at a trial. Kimmel's face had gone pale, his usual smugness replaced by something approaching panic. He was losing control of his own show, being outclassed by a guest who had turned his attempted humiliation into a masterpiece of professional destruction. "You think you can sit there and tear me down?" Ford continued, his voice rising for the first time. "You who built your career on making people uncomfortable, who thrives on other people's embarrassment, who mistakes cruelty for comedy. You're exactly what's wrong with this business, all spectacle, no substance." Kimmel finally found his voice, but it came out strained, desperate. "Look, Harrison, you're taking this way too seriously. This is comedy. This is entertainment. Our audience expects—" "Your audience expects better," Ford cut him off, his patience finally exhausted. "They deserve hosts who elevate their guests, not tear them down for sport. They deserve entertainment that doesn't come at the expense of basic human decency." Ford turned toward the audience, addressing them directly, his charisma and natural authority making Kimmel invisible by comparison. "You came here tonight expecting to see a conversation between professionals. Instead, you're witnessing what happens when someone mistakes a microphone for a weapon and a stage for a battlefield." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Some were nodding in agreement, others looked uncomfortable, but all were riveted by Ford's passionate defense of not just himself, but of standards that seemed to be disappearing from the industry. Turning back to Kimmel, Ford delivered what would become the most quoted line of the confrontation. "Jimmy, you've confused having a platform with having something worth saying. You've mistaken having an audience with deserving one." Kimmel's face crumpled under the weight of Ford's words. His entire professional identity was being dismantled on his own show, in front of his own audience, by a man who represented everything he could never be: genuine, respected, and truly talented. "This interview is over," Ford declared, but he wasn't moving toward the exit yet. Something in his posture suggested he had more to say, one final blow that would end this confrontation once and for all. Kimmel, sensing an opportunity to regain control, made the fatal mistake of speaking when he should have remained silent. "Harrison, come on. Don't be such a prima donna. You're acting like a child who can't take a joke. Maybe this is why directors don't want to work with you anymore. You can't handle a little criticism." The words were like gasoline on a fire. Ford's entire demeanor shifted, his legendary composure finally cracking as decades of professionalism gave way to raw, unfiltered anger. His voice, when it came, was barely controlled rage wrapped in the precision of a man who had spent his life mastering the art of performance. "Prima donna?" Ford's voice cut through the studio like a blade. "Jimmy, you want to see a prima donna? You want to see someone who can't handle criticism? Look in the mirror. You're the one who built a career on punching down, who hides behind writers and producers when your jokes fall flat, who blames everyone else when your ratings drop." Ford stepped even closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence now completely overwhelming. The host. "You talk about directors not wanting to work with me? Let me tell you something about directors, Jimmy. Real directors, Ridley Scott, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, they call me when they want someone who shows up prepared, who knows their lines, who treats their craft with respect." The mention of these legendary names hit like hammer blows. Ford wasn't just defending himself. He was reminding everyone in the studio of the caliber of filmmakers who had chosen to work with him repeatedly throughout his career. "You know what directors don't call?" Ford continued, his voice gaining momentum. "They don't call people who think talent means being able to read cue cards with a smirk. They don't call people whose idea of entertainment is making others feel small. They don't call people like you, Jimmy, because you're not an artist. You're a parasite." The word parasite echoed through the studio like a gunshot. Kimmel's face went white, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The audience gasped audibly, finally understanding they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Ford wasn't finished. You feed off other people's discomfort, their embarrassment, their vulnerability. You invite guests onto your show not to celebrate their work or engage in meaningful conversation, but to find new ways to humiliate them for your audience's amusement. Kimmel finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate whisper. "That's not... I don't... This is comedy, Harrison. This is what people expect from late-night television." "No, Jimmy," Ford replied with devastating finality. "This is what you've convinced yourself people want because it's easier than actually being funny. It's easier than being clever. It's easier than being good at your job." Ford began to remove his microphone, the simple action somehow more dramatic than any scripted moment. "You know what the real tragedy is here? You have this platform, this opportunity to bring joy to people, to celebrate the incredible work that artists do, to create something meaningful. Instead, you use it to tear people down because you don't have the talent to build anything worthwhile yourself." The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the production crew had stopped moving, transfixed by Ford's systematic destruction of everything Kimmel represented. The veteran actor's words weren't just criticism. They were a moral indictment of an entire approach to entertainment. Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Harrison, look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over? Talk about your new project. Give the audience what they came to see." Ford's laugh was harsh, final. "What they came to see? Jimmy, they came to see a conversation between professionals. What they got was a masterclass in how not to treat people who have given their lives to this industry." Ford straightened his jacket with deliberate precision, every movement calculated to demonstrate his complete control over the situation. "I've spent 50 years in this business, Jimmy. I've worked with the best, learned from the best, and tried to be the best I could be. I won't let someone who represents everything wrong with modern entertainment diminish that legacy." The tension in the room was suffocating. Ford's final words hung in the air like a death sentence for Kimmel's credibility. The host sat frozen, completely outmatched and humiliated on his own show, while Ford prepared to deliver the exit that would cement this confrontation in television history. Ford turned toward the audience one final time, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, you deserve better than this. You deserve entertainment that elevates rather than degrades, hosts who celebrate their guests rather than exploit them, and comedy that comes from cleverness, not cruelty. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the studio. They were applauding not just Ford's words, but his courage to speak truth to power, to stand up against the toxic culture that had infected late-night television. Kimmel sat speechless, his face a mask of humiliation and defeat. His writers, producers, and crew members stood frozen, unsure how to handle a situation that had spiraled so far beyond their control. This wasn't part of any script. This was a raw, unfiltered reality playing out in real time. Ford began walking toward the exit, but paused at the edge of the stage. Without turning around, he delivered his final, devastating assessment. "Jimmy, when you go home tonight, when you're alone with your thoughts, ask yourself this question. In 20 years, will anyone remember you for making them laugh, or just for making them uncomfortable? Will they remember you for the joy you brought into their lives, or the dignity you stripped away from others?" The words echoed through the studio as Ford continued his exit, his stride confident and purposeful. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the chaos he was leaving behind. The veteran actor had said everything he needed to say, delivered every blow with surgical precision, and emerged victorious from a battle he never wanted to fight. The audience erupted into another standing ovation as Ford disappeared behind the curtain. The applause seemed to go on forever, drowning out any attempt by Kimmel to regain control of his show. When the camera panned back to the host's desk, Kimmel looked like a broken man, his usual smugness replaced by the hollow stare of someone who had been thoroughly, publicly destroyed. We'll be right back after these messages," Kimmel managed to whisper into his microphone, his voice barely audible over the continued applause. The show cut to commercial, but the damage was already done. The confrontation was over, but its impact was just beginning. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were circulating on social media. "Respect Harrison Ford" began trending worldwide, as viewers praised the actor's dignity and professionalism in the face of Kimmel's unprovoked attacks. Entertainment reporters scrambled to get reactions from industry insiders, with many expressing their support for Ford and criticism of Kimmel's conduct. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Kimmel's reputation. Advertisers began pulling their sponsorships, citing concerns about the show's toxic environment. Fellow celebrities started canceling their upcoming appearances, unwilling to risk similar humiliation. The network was flooded with complaints from viewers who felt Kimmel had crossed a line from which there was no return. Industry veterans spoke out in support of Ford, praising his grace under pressure and his willingness to stand up for basic professional standards. Directors, producers, and fellow actors shared stories of Ford's professionalism and kindness, painting a picture that stood in stark contrast to Kimmel's behavior that night. The confrontation became a watershed moment for late-night television, forcing a long-overdue conversation about the difference between comedy and cruelty, between entertainment and exploitation. Ford's words about dignity and respect resonated far beyond the studio walls, sparking discussions about how celebrities should be treated and what audiences should expect from their entertainment. Kimmel's ratings plummeted in the weeks following the incident, as viewers turned away from a host they now saw as mean-spirited and unprofessional. The once popular show struggled to book A-list guests, with many celebrities and their representatives citing the Ford incident as a reason for their reluctance to appear. Harrison Ford, meanwhile, emerged from the confrontation with his reputation not only intact, but enhanced. His passionate defense of professionalism and dignity earned him new fans and reinforced his status as one of Hollywood's most respected figures. The incident became a defining moment in his legacy, not just as an actor, but as a man of principle who refused to be diminished by someone unworthy of sharing the same stage. The entertainment industry learned a valuable lesson that night. Respect isn't just a courtesy, it's a requirement. And when that respect is absent, there are still those with the courage and conviction to demand it, no matter the cost.